for old school. But that group is really awesome. I definitely encourage people to check it out. We're doing a thing called Ohana Stargazing, which we did here in Salt, actually, not too long ago. And we're going to do another one at Mokini Heiau on the Big Island, which I was just at. Mokini Heiau, if you don't know, is a human sacrificial temple back during the time of the Kapu. And it was converted by the Kahuna Nui of Mokini, Lemomi Lum, into a temple to the children of the world. So her family has had that temple in their care for generations. And she specifically lifted the kapu and changed it into that, which I thought was awesome. And so she's invited our group to come out and do star stories, telling mo'olelo Hawaiian legends about stars, and then have telescopes there for people to look through and check out, and invite kids there. So if you want to go to the Big Island on August 27th, fly on over. You guys done?
No, beach cleanup.
Stargazing, I'm sure is at night.
Yeah.
It's actually from like 4 to 9. So
So that's a really big day, but totally doable.
Yeah.
Go straight from the beach cleanup.
Can you see your face in this just because the people on
I don't
Zoom?
see anything of myself, which is
Oh, let's try
good
to
because I
figure it
hate
out.
that.
Actually,
let me-
why don't we just ask Zoom? Can you see Sam?
It's like asking.
Yes.
You guys,
Oh, you can?
all right.
Okay.
I think this is actually just a PowerPoint that goes vertically because it's unpleasant. So the thing you guys asked me to come here today to talk about is Imua TMT. So Imua TMT is a Native Hawaiian organization that supports the construction of the 30-meter telescope on Mauna Kea. And the group started as a Facebook group that was very unofficial back in 2015, I think, like during that time period. A lady named Malia Martin started it. And then it kind of grew from there. And in 2019, there was another round of protests. So if you don't know the saga that is the 30-meter telescope project, I'll just briefly, the TMT is a telescope that has a 30-meter diameter mirror that the state of Hawaii is looking to build on Mauna Kea, which is one of 2 major mountains on Hawaii Island. The process for bringing TMT here involved people from the state of Hawaii and community members going out and lobbying the groups that build these telescopes and convincing them to build it here instead of anywhere else. And there's one guy in particular, actually named Wali Chibashi, who is descended from Poliahu, the snow goddess of Mauna Kea, and he still is a cultural practitioner going up there. And he was one of the spearhead guys going there. So, and he's an amazing person. He should probably do all these talks, but he's busy actually working for the University of Hawaii, taking care of Mauna Kea. That process started, I don't even know when, like 2010. And for years and years, there was all of this discussion about it. The Office of Hawaiian Affairs was voted in favor of it. And then there was all these contested case hearings. We have a very extensive environmental review process for all these telescopes that go on Mauna Kea. So there's an EIS that you have to go through, and you have to talk about what impacts are going to be, and you have to talk about what you're going to do to mitigate it. And then usually you get sued if you're trying to issue a permit. And so there's a contested case hearing. And so we went through one of those, and then the Supreme Court got involved, and that was in 2015 when the Supreme Court ruled that the permit was invalid, and the protesters were there blocking the road. And then they started over again, and TMT did a second contested case hearing, and then they went to the Supreme Court again, and their permit was found valid. I was not involved in any of that. For literally a decade, I was just watching and being like, this is cool. Yeah, let's keep going. Like, okay, you guys you didn't do the permit right, got overturned, go back, do it again. Okay, fine. And then they actually went and did it again. I'm like, that's amazing. You should do that. And then in 2019, I was working at, good Lord, where was I working? I guess I was at my current job at HMSA, where the protests blew up again. And this was after the TMT had gone through all this process, and they had done everything that they legally were required to do. And there were polls out at the time, and people I was talking to, and vast majority of the population supporting it, including 70% of Native Hawaiians, although the polls were not accurate at that time about what that meant. But it just was amazing to me that a small group of people were standing on a road blocking this project. And I was just like, what is happening? Like, where are the people in favor of this project that are apparently the vast majority of the population? And why are we not rallying at the Capitol like everybody else is? And so I started looking around for whoever was in charge of TMT's ground game. And I didn't find anyone except Imua TMT. And so I was like, we need to do something. And so I wrote a Star Advertiser article, and me and Malia planned the first pro TMT rally at the Capitol in 2019. There were others happening around, but this was the first one that kind of got publicly announced. And I wrote a Star Advertiser article basically saying, you know, TMT supporters need to be patient, but start doing something, start taking action, and laying out my argument in favor of it. And so from that, I thought that Imua TMT as an organization would disappear after 3 months because this would not take long, because there's people blocking the road. It's illegal to block roads in Hawaii. And so these people would be arrested and then we would move on. But that's not what happened. The initial arrest didn't happen. And then there was an explosion of support for the protesters. And so far as people thought that there was some reason that the arrest didn't happen, there was like a moral shift and people thought there was an argument. And so I started getting more and more involved in what is the argument? What are the talking points? What's going on? What is all this information? And the thing that disturbed me was the more and more research I did, the more and more I discovered that every single talking point against the project was just simply false. There was just no accuracy whatsoever. On top of blatant lies and misrepresentations, which seems to be par for the course for politics in the United States these days, which is a whole nother issue. But it was just very troubling to me to see this. And so I started walking through it and figuring out, okay, we need to start putting out flyers. And so imuatmt.org was born, and we started putting together all this information. Many, many months and then years later, I ended up drafting this presentation that I'm going to walk through soon about sacredness and consent. There was and I presented this to the American Astronomical Society. And there was a question about whether or not Native Hawaiians as a race-based concept needed to consent to the use of Mauna Kea. And so me and my fellow Native Hawaiians on Imua TMT and lots of other Native Hawaiians in the community, along with non-Native Hawaiian community members, discussed it. And we were like, we need to explain the history of Hawaii to people. So the first thing I start with is, who am I? And I'm sorry about this because you guys have just heard like 2 minutes of who I am, but.
So if you move the mouse over to the right and then scroll, it'll change
Oh.
here too.
Do I need to pull the
2 fingers down.
Oh, I see.
Oh, got you. Okay. So I put this together because in the world of identity politics that TMT occupies, let's be honest, I look like a white guy, right? And so nobody knows that I'm Native Hawaiian, and nobody knows the history of Native Hawaiians and how we all got here and how we all got to look partially like me and partially like other people. And it's a beautiful story, frankly, and that's why I tell it. But it's important to know who you are. And also in Hawaiian genealogy, in Hawaiian culture and Hawaiian history, one of the things we did in ancient times was if you went anywhere, you had to tell them who you were going back multiple generations. And if you got it wrong, you were killed on the spot because we didn't know who else you were, right? We only had an oral tradition, so we had to identify who you are. So that's the impetus for this family tree. So this is my family tree going back as far as I've been able to trace it so far. On the left side, I'm descended from a chief named Kalani Ho'ulumokui Kekai. And so there's chiefs from Maui too at the top. And I haven't quite figured all that out, but that's kind of the family tradition. But the one we know for sure is Kalani Ho'ulumokui Kekai. He got pushed off a cliff at the Battle of Nuuanu by Kamehameha when he was conquering the islands. And so that's always a fascinating story. And I used to give tours of the Capitol when I was interning in DC. And so there's a statue of Kamehameha in the Capitol. And it was always, there's a blurb at the bottom of the statue that says, united the islands into a peaceful island kingdom. And I always thought that was hilarious. It was like, yeah, that uniting word, they weren't peaceful before they were united. They pushed my ancestors right off a cliff. And it's one of the things that it's just history, right? I mean, my son is actually, I told him the story. He's like still upset that Kamehameha killed one of our ancestors. I'm like, it's not that, just let it go. It was a long time ago. It's not that big a deal. But one of the things about it was, oh my God, I lost my train of thought here. But the interesting thing about it is there's an island called Hawaii and there's a state called Hawaii. And the reason for that is because the guys from Hawaii conquered the rest of the islands, right? And that's just how it is. That was history. And there's a lot of reasons for that happening. And I'll go into that a little bit at the end too. So then Oliver Holmes and Mahi were married, and there's kind of that line. The fascinating part of history gets down to the guy named James Anderson King. He was in the provisional government after the overthrow of the monarchy. So one half of my family tree was part of the overthrow or immediately afterwards. And then on the other side, Pauline Namihineokalai Evans was in the court of Queen Liliuokalani. So she was on the other side, the monarchy side. So Samuel Wilder King and Pauline, when they got married, it was kind of a thing in the society because it was these two sides of the community coming together through marriage, literally, and trying to heal that rift. And I just kind of learned that in the last few years, my aunt. It's something that is really powerful. It's Samuel Wilder King also is a far more impressive person than I will ever be. He served in both world wars and was the governor of Hawaii during the territory. And then my grandpa, and then Samuel Palethorpe King was my grandfather. He was a federal judge, and he was the author of a thing called Broken Trust, a book called Broken Trust. And so he was during the Kamehameha schools got into a huge scandal because the Supreme Court justices were appointing the Bishop of State trustees, and the governor at the time tried to corrupt the Supreme Court to get himself appointed as a Bishop of State trustee. And so it was kind of a huge disaster. And then there was also lots of internal politics with people at Kamehameha schools, certain trustees trying to impose their vision of what Hawaiian was. And it was a big fight. And my grandfather was part of the team that exposed that, a group of Native Hawaiians. And then my dad and my mom's a Rotary. My dad is an attorney who just works really hard and he puts his kids through school. So that's what he does. And, but he's born and raised. So that's kind of the long story of that genealogy. Getting into TMT now. There's two things I'm going to talk about. There's a whole slew of arguments, and you guys really care about environmental arguments. And all I can say about environmental arguments is that there is no environmental threat from TMT whatsoever at all. None. Like, I wouldn't support the project if it threatened our aquifer, right? I mean, how horrible a human being would I have to be to support a telescope if I thought it was going to damage our aquifer? How insane would the state of Hawaii, the governor, the mayor of the Big Island, all the legislators that support this be to support a project that actually endangered an aquifer at all? I mean, look at the furore over Red Hill, right? I mean, Red Hill actually endangered our aquifer. They actually poured fuel into our aquifer, and now we're all losing our minds because that's actually bad. TMT has no risk at all, zero, none. So I don't even have a slide on it because it's not even an argument. Like, if you actually talk to the water experts, and they went through the EIS, they did all of this. But there's one guy in particular I talked to, and he told me the story of there was a study they did of Mauna Kea. This guy in particular has drilled holes through the Big Island. And the story he told is they had put all these buckets down Mauna Kea, and they were studying rainfall and trying to figure out like the isotopes of rain, and how long it would take for water to filter through Mauna Kea. And he's basically saying you could pour gasoline on top of Mauna Kea, which is not happening, by the way, but you could do this. It would never get to an aquifer because its half-life is shorter than the time it takes to filter through Mauna Kea. It takes 5,000 years to filter through Mauna Kea to get to an aquifer. So it's literally a natural cleaning mechanism, right? That's on top of the fact that the telescope, TMT in particular, is being required to double line all their waste trucks and drive all the waste off the mountain. None of the other telescopes are even close to doing this, right? Like, they're all working on it, trying to get up to the standard that TMT is at, which is a credit to the community, to the protesters, to the people that come out and keep UH's feet to the fire, to be quite honest. They're always coming out and they're saying, you got to do this, you got to do that. And they've kept on top of the astronomy sector. And I think that's a positive result. And the end result is TMT, where there's no cesspool. There's a cesspool for the other telescopes. There's not going to be one for TMT. They're not using any mercury in the mirror, which is another thing, like small amounts of mercury hit struck. So there's nothing to talk about on the environmental side because there's no danger whatsoever. The only argument that's raised now is like, oh, we don't know enough, right? Like, it could fall in this river. But at some point, it's just like, we do actually know enough. And the answer is that there's no risk at all. So we've been through it. Don't worry about it. Or worry about it to the extent you need to, but then move forward once you've made a decision as a community. The big arguments that come up now are sacredness, right? People say Mauna Kea is sacred to the native Hawaiians, therefore you can't build here. Mauna Kea is not sacred as a native Hawaiian matter. That is an objectively established historical fact. The number one reason is that the Kapu religion, which governed ancient Hawaii. So before Kamehameha took over the islands, we were just kind of another island in Polynesia, right? And we were under the Kapu religion, this taboo religion in other Polynesian islands. That religion had all kinds of aspects. Men and women couldn't eat together. There was human sacrifice. If your shadow touched an ali'i, they could kill you, right? Lots of, in my opinion, frankly, horrible things, not things that I want back. And when Captain Cook mapped Hawaii and the rest of the world started showing up, right? For a long time, Hawaii, there was navigation between the other Polynesian islands. Hawaii was connected. And at some point we just stopped. Probably because it's really nice here. Like, why would you, right? That's like, except if you're a Makai Nana who gets killed because your shadow touches them. Other than that, nice. The rest of the world showed up eventually. And at that time, the Kapu religion obviously started breaking down because for centuries, that was it. That was your entire life. Now, there were atheists in Hawaii, which is something no one ever talks about, called Aya, which I thought was extremely fascinating. There's a guy named David Malo who wrote a book called Hawaiian Antiquities, which if you want to know about ancient Hawaii, that is the place to start. And he mentions that these people existed. I don't think anybody's ever studied them, but they did exist. And it's just important because it shows that there was an idea that the Kapu was not the only way to understand the world. But for most people, that was the deal, right? That's how the elite maintained their power, right? Just like monarchs all over the world had the mandate of heaven. They used religion to enforce their will. It was the same thing in Hawaii. The Kapu religion starts breaking down when people show up and they're not subject to the Kapu, right? They're not getting killed because they're eating with women. The women are going on the ships. There's nothing bad's happening. So it's going to destroy the social order. Now Kamehameha conquers the islands and he starts trying to impose a standard Kapu on everybody, a standard religion. And that's the only time there was ever a native Hawaiian religion. Because again, Hawaii was a creation from the guy conquering from Hawaii Island, right? So the only time there was a united Hawaiian kingdom was under him, under the Kapu. That was the only time there was a Hawaiian religion. That ended when Kamehameha I died. And this is the craziest part of the story. And so this past weekend, I literally went to the battlefield of Ku'umo'o on the Big Island. The battlefield of Ku'umo'o is where the last battle of the Hawaiian Civil War that you've never heard of happened. No one even knows that we had a civil war in Hawaii. I didn't know this until like 4 years ago. I grew born and raised here. I don't know anyone else who is that knows this story. And what happened is that Queen Kahumanu, after Kamehameha I died, Queen Kahumanu was Kamehameha I's favorite wife. She was tired of the Kapu religion because it prevented her from eating with men in the heiau where political decisions were made. So she was the queen regent because Kamehameha II was so young. Queen Keopuolani was also tired of it and she was Kamehameha II's mother, and she was the most sacred queen in the Hawaiian kingdom. But she also had tired of the religion, and she also couldn't eat with men. I mean, even though she actually had been doing it. So they convinced Kamehameha II, Liholiho, to eat dinner with them in front of all of the chiefs. And when they did that, the chiefs cried out, "Ai Noa," and it means free eating. And what it meant was that the Kapu, the Kapu on eating together, had been broken. And that was a fundamental prohibition under the Kapu religion. And it's breaking in front of all the chiefs in this manner meant that the Kapu religion was gone. That theocracy was done. It no longer had power over the kingdom. It was a declaration not only of women's liberty, which is why I always thought the story was so inspirational, but also of religious freedom, of the right to believe what you want to believe without somebody forcing their beliefs on you. And that's, I think, an inspiring story, one that I like telling. But the more important part is that for this kind of a conversation in this academic section, the chiefs that didn't want to end the Kapu religion, including Kamehameha II's cousin, Kauikeoli, I'm blanking on his name now, but Kamehameha II's cousin didn't want to end the Kapu religion because he had been given Kukeilimoku, the war god idol, from Kamehameha I. And so his his power was based on the Kapu religion. So he demanded that Kamehameha II reinstate it. And at the Battle of Ku'umo'o, Kamehameha II's forces under his prime minister destroyed the forces of Kamehameha II's nephew. And Kamehameha II, his cousin, his wife, Monono, the wife of this cousin, also was at this battle fighting to keep the Kapu religion alive. She was the sister of Kamehameha II's prime minister, Kalaimoku. And she was executed on the battlefield by her brother or by his forces. And that was the end of the Kapu religion. Like, that was an official declaration by the Hawaiian kingdom, by our highest political power, by our highest religious authorities. The highest religious authority was Hewa Hewa, the high priest, and he ordered all the heiau desecrated and destroyed. That was the end of the Kapu religion's right to impose land use decisions on Hawaii. There's people that still maintain the religious belief, and that's not objectionable at all. That's a beautiful thing. There's aspects of a new kind of Kapu religion that are based on respecting nature and integrating your life with your environment, which is wonderful, but it doesn't control what Native Hawaiians believe anymore. And that is a fundamental human right of Native Hawaiians. And so that breaking meant that if to say that Mauna Kea is sacred to Native Hawaiians is historically inaccurate and a violation of that human right that we have as Native Hawaiians to declare what we believe ourselves, right? You can say, I believe that Mauna Kea is sacred. I believe in this new Kapu religion that says it's sacred. That's fine. But everybody has those religious beliefs, right? That's why we have religious freedom in the United States of America, right? That's where that right came from. And also in the Kingdom of Hawaii, the constitutions of the kingdom also declared religious freedom repeatedly. We had numerous constitutions, and every single one declared that. So that's just the first point of why Mauna Kea is not sacred to Native Hawaiians. The second point is that Kahuna Nui Lemo'i Lum has explained that in the Kapu religion, the search for knowledge was a sacred act, right? And on Mauna Kea, if you are using a telescope to collect starlight, to study the heavens, to perpetuate astronomy, our cultural legacy of celestial navigation and natural observation, that honors the sacred nature of Mauna Kea under the Kapu religion, right? It's not a violation at all. It's in fact a celebration of that heritage of excellence that our ancestors had to have in order to sail here from Tahiti and to sail back, right? That's hard to do, and you can't do it if you're a slouch. And so you have to work hard. And that's the kind of excellence that TMT brings, that the astronomy sector brings, right? That and the whole state of Hawaii trying to drive, more Native Hawaiians, especially, and all our keiki, to focus on astronomy and to study STEM, all of that stuff. That's an honoring of that nature, that sacred nature of Mauna Kea in her belief system. And she is the Kununui of Mo'okini Heiau, which is why she's inviting people to come there and put up telescopes and talk about the star lines of Hawaii. That's number two. The third reason TMT isn't actually a desecration of Mauna Kea is that during the Kapu religion, during the pre-kingdom times, our ancestors mined Mauna Kea for lava rock because it was the densest rock in the islands, and you could use it for carving other things, and you could make rock that could carve other rock. And the area we mined it out of was 960 times the size of TMT. It was all over the place. It was just a huge area. And the priests did this themselves. They used it for industrial purposes. And that means that if you're looking at this from a sacredness standpoint, from a historical, objective analysis of traditional and customary practices of Native Hawaiian people, you can't actually argue that it's a violation, which we actually did that analysis. That's required by the Supreme Court. It's required by the EIS. It's required in the contested case hearings. We went through all of this. Many of the protesters that now come and say they have these religious practices, it's proven in the contested case hearings that they started their practices after the protest started. They created this belief in order to justify their protest. And you can have a belief, and that's a beautiful thing, and good for you. Okay? Believe in what you need to believe in, but it doesn't give you the right to impose your religious beliefs on others. I mean, we've seen this left, right, and center. I mean, just bring up Roe v. Wade and you will know about religious beliefs and how important it is that there's a balancing of what people think is sacred and safe and spiritual and what people believe is their right as a human being. It's fundamental to the kind of society I want to live in, and I think all of us do. Am I moving? There we go. I got it.
There.
I got it. This is a line that I also like to note from one of the kumus that I was working with, Kimo Stone. And it's basically reiterating what I've said, which is that modern astronomy is consistent with Hawaiian values. It's about honesty and excellence. It's about seeking knowledge and sharing equally. And that sharing is really important, right? Ka'ana means to do what we did in our environmental review process. I mean, our extensive environmental review process, and that's, our review process is so extensive that we barely build homes in Hawaii anymore because you have to go through so much environmental review process, right? And we're all talking about affordable housing and all these things. It's like, yeah, okay, that's because we do that. And TMT did that twice. They will be doing it a third time, by the way, which I will get to in a second. I know I'm probably talking to, how much time do I even have, by the way?
Better wrap it up.
Yeah.
This is great though.
Yeah.
4 minutes.
4 minutes to 7, but
So I haven't even talked about consent. I don't even know where to start. Consent is a red herring, basically. It's a distraction from everything I've already outlined. The reality is that the people of Hawaii have consented to building TMT on Mauna Kea, and we live in a democracy. That is the society we live in. We can talk about the overthrow and all of these things, and I understand the 100 years of tears and the pain, but the actual reality of the history of Hawaii, which I'm gonna jump, I mean, you can look at this slide and take it in. This is all the ways people have consented, and pointing out the fact that stopping TMT also violates the consent of Native Hawaiians that have supported the program, right? Through legal means, right? We've advocated, but just because I'm not willing to stand on a road, all of a sudden, I'm not important, right? So just getting past just that issue, the history of, and this is kind of a slide that's more focused on my opinion, not really in TMT, because we have a board and they have their own, everyone has their own manal. But this is something I like to point out. The Kingdom of Hawaii was never a race-based place. It was always multicultural. It was always multi-ethnic. And I'm talking right from the very start, because like I said, Kamehameha came from Hawaii Island. And to conquer the other islands, he had the help of John Young and Isaac Davis, right, who were not born here prior to 1778. There were two Haole guys he kidnapped and then made them train his troops how to use cannons. And after they did that, he made them into chiefs. He made them into elite, right? They were under the kapu. They actually became subject to the kapu. They had to be honored as chiefs. And from that point forward, if you were born in Hawaii, you were a subject of the kingdom. The laws of the Kingdom of Hawaii didn't have any racial exclusions at all. The only race-based law in the kingdom was the monarchy itself. And what that law said in the Constitution was that the monarch had to be of the original stock of indigenous elite. But that's about class, right? It's about protecting the elite's power. It wasn't about being Native Hawaiian, you're the only person who gets a say. And so to me, that's a beautiful story. That's a story I like to tell about Hawaii, about this place. I mean, just because look around the room. This is Hawaii, right? I mean, look at me. I'm half Polish, Hawaiian, Chinese, Scottish. My kids are Japanese, German, Hawaiian, Chinese, English, French. That's beautiful. That is an awesome story. I've been to 40 countries on this earth. Everywhere I've gone, I've told people I'm from Hawaii, and everybody loves Hawaii. They love meeting people from Hawaii. They want to come to Hawaii, and it's not because the weather's nice. It's part of it, but it's not the biggest reason. It's because of the people here. It's because of this aloha spirit that we have, where we represent the humanity that so many people want, where we are not all tied to our racial identity or our ancestry. It's about the content of our character and not the color of our skin. And that's what Hawaii always was right from the start. And so we are where we are today, and we live in a democracy where everyone has a say. And this democracy has consented to the construction of TMT. And that's the only consent that's required. That's about it. So if you have any questions.
Oh, wow.
I think that is actually.
Is that really it?
Yeah.
Okay.
It is like 20 more slides, but
No,
That's
that
what I was like,
was the last. That was the last one. I mean, and that's the
do you
most
wanna,
fundamental thing.
Do you want to do the closing just so people have to go and then we can do questions after?
yeah, that works.
So mahalo for having me.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
How many rotaries have you talked
I don't actually know, probably about 10. This particular presentation, this is the first time I've done this one. Oh, the one
No,
thing,
Nope.
sorry, before you close, I should mention this. I know you've already switched off of me, but I'll give you a real quick update of what's happening right now. Because of the protest, in part because of the protest and because of all the attention that was paid to Native Hawaiian issues, the legislature in the past legislative session has allocated $1 billion to Native Hawaiian issues, $600 million to DHHL for all the people on the wait list, another couple $1 million for the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. Now, OHA has gotten its annual allocation increased from 17 million to like 21 million. They got a 64 million lump sum, right? There was a settlement agreement with people on the DHHL wait list, another $300 million. So there's a tremendous amount of action on Native Hawaiian issues. One of the most important to TMT is that the management structure of Mauna Kea has changed, right? UH used to be the sublessee, DLNR used to run the place. Now there's a new board that's been created. And that board has on it has a traditional and customary practitioner and then a descendant of a traditional and customary practitioner. And right now the governor is looking for names to get people appointed to that board. So I've been working on getting people to submit their names and get on the board so we can get this process started as quickly as possible. And so that's another thing that the protesters wanted, and that has changed. And so there's going to be a new management structure of Mauna Kea. On top of that, the National Science Foundation has started its scoping sessions. So next week they will be taking hearings. They'll be doing hearings on what should be the scope of their environmental impact statement. So like I said, they're going to do this a third time. The federal government is now going to come in with another $800 million to build TMT because the price tag went up $1 billion because of all the delays. They are now going to do an entire another EIS. They're going to do an entire cultural impact statement. They're going through these scope meetings right now to find out what's the scope of the alternatives they should study, what environmental impacts they should study, what cultural impacts they should study. After they're done doing that, they will have a cultural agreement with anybody that claims an impact. And that will involve more money going into the impacted community. So there's a tremendous amount of movement happening on this right now, and a lot of resources coming into our state and into the Native Hawaiian community in particular surrounding this issue, which is great. I mean, this is what we want, right? This is what we want to do to move the project forward in a way that is Pono, in a way that heals the rift in our community, right? That allows us to be happy when it's done, if it's done, right? If the agreement, if the NSF comes in and says, this is what we will do, that's a way that we can do it right. If they decide not to, then it's going to die.
Thank you. All right, so we're going to do the four-way test. First, is it the truth?
Is it the truth?
Come off mute. 2, is it fair to all concerned? 3, will it build goodwill and better friendship? 4, will it be beneficial
to all concerned?
And 5, is it eco-friendly and fun?
Awesome.
All right, thank you all. Anyone can go if they want, but we can stay on for a little bit longer if we want to do a Q&A.
Do you want it in the recording? Though?
Yeah, I'll end the recording.
I just have one, I think, quick question. At one point,